Alright, so today we're going to be looking at the Ford and Carter years. So, we talked the last time we talked was we learned about how Nixon quit as the Watergate scandal came to light. And as you can see here is Gerald Ford taking the Oval Office shortly after, where the United States for the first time invoked the 25th Amendment, which states deals with explains what happens when a president resigns or is replaced, that sort of thing. Okay. So Ford's unusual road to the presidency. So he's the only president to never be elected to the vice presidency or presidency. So what that means is that before he became vice president, he was chosen by the 25th Amendment to be vice president. Okay. And then same thing happened for the president. He's the only person to become president and vice president under the 25th Amendment. The other person to become vice president under the 25th Amendment is Nelson Rockefeller, who was his VP. Okay? So, one of the things that really aggravated Americans, but for the soul of the nation and to try to spare the country a trial that could drag on America's name in the mud, he decided to give Nixon a full pardon, which covered all the crimes that Nixon committed or may have committed as president. And a lot of people were ticked off. They were outraged. But here's the the interesting thing is that none of his former employees were pardoned, and nearly all of them served prison terms. All right, let's talk about a few things during President Ford's short presidency. In 1973, we have the OPEC, the oil embargo, where net inflation rose from 6% in 73 to 10% in 74. Ford started what was called a WIN campaign, whip inflation now, but this failed. But Ford would urge Americans to cut back on the use of oil and gas. He also cut government spending, and interest rates went up, triggering the worst recession in 40 years. Alright, Ford's foreign policy. We had the Helsinki Accords in 1975, which legitimized the Soviet-drawn borders in Eastern Europe. Okay? This agreement also allowed for more open exchanges of people and information, and although it was considered a milestone, it was still a very one-sided piece of accord. Okay. Anyway, so that's pretty much it for him. Let's move it into 76, which is the bicentennial year in American history, the 200th anniversary of America. Now you gotta remember, America's a baby compared to China, which is 3,000 years old. Let that sink in. Alright, so Carter in the White House. Carter was a former peanut farmer. He's also the former governor of Georgia. One of the things he promised he would do is that he would never lie to the American people. And Carter and Ford squared off over things like energy, inflation, and unemployment. And Carter won by a very close margin. It's one of the closest elections, I believe, in American history. And one of the things he did is he talked to the American people like FDR did through what were called fireside chats by radio and TV. So you can see here, Carter only won 50% of the popular vote, and Ford won 48%. So very close election. Not anywhere near a landslide. So how did the economy change in the 70s? Well, you have less manufacturing jobs, more jobs in communication, transportation, and retail. You have greater overseas competition. The U.S. iron and steel and clothing plant closing and layoffs, and the OPEC raised their oil prices in the 70s. So let's talk about Carter's domestic agenda. He urged Americans to cut back on their consumption of oil and gas. That did not go over well. He passed what was called the National Energy Act, which taxed gas-guzzling cars. It removed price controls on oil and gas produced in the United States and gave tax credits for development of alternative energy. Okay? So, in the end, Carter was trying to get us to use less oil and gas and use other alternative sources of energy. Okay, this didn't go over well because um, so we had gas shortages, people throughout Carter's term, and it was a mess. In 1979, inflation hit 11.3%, 14% by 1980, and then he gave his famous malaise speech where he complained of a crisis of spirit in Americans. Um, and we'll talk. he, I think one of the problems Carter had is that he definitely was doing too much. Carter wanted everything thrown at his desk between the times that people were using the White House tennis courts to, um, nuclear testing. Okay, all kinds of stuff, and so one of his downfalls was that he did too much himself. He didn't let others take over the reins. Okay, and in this Malay speech cost him the 1980 election, which we'll talk more about that later. Carter and draft evaders. He wanted to end divisions in the country, so he gave full pardons to all draft evaders, but no pardons for deserters. And there was a few people that were like, wait a minute, that's not right. But for the most part, most Americans were like, you know what? We're out of Vietnam. Let's forget about that madness. Let's put it behind us. All right. In March of '79, there was a nuclear power plant at 3 Mile Island that broke down at risk for a nuclear meltdown. This caused widespread fear, and many Americans doubted that nuclear energy was safe. Um, so yeah, remember this nuclear energy was very unpredictable back then. It still is today. I always I think it was Homer Simpson that worked at a nuclear plant. I believe there's an episode where he got infected and he all kinds of weird stuff happened. Anyway, that was like a long time ago. Anyway, but nuclear power plants are going to be held to much stricter safety standards. So as you can see, here's what some look like: giant round smokestacks. Carter and civil rights. He appointed a lot more women and more African Americans to his administration than any other previous administration in U.S. history. He also appointed Andrew Young, who was was part of the civil rights movement in the '60s. Andrew Young is from Atlanta, Georgia, my hometown, and he became the U.S. ambassador to the UN. Carter's foreign policy, everything, and this is when it comes to his foreign policy, it's both good and bad. He was very passive. Much, he, Interesting fact about Carter is there was never a single shot fired by America really during his term in office. He kept the peace. He was a peacemaker, and I think a lot of that was due to his Christian faith. And so that's why he based his platform on human rights, where he publicly criticized the Soviet Union and South Africa. Most countries that violated human rights no longer received U.S. foreign aid. All right, so he created some enemies by cutting off foreign aid across the world. The Panama Canal Treaty. Now we didn't give the Panama Canal back until 1999, but that got started in the '70s. That shift. He tried to do that. One of his greatest accomplishments was having the leaders of Israel and the leader of Egypt. So Anwar Sadat, I believe I'm saying that name right. I could be wrong. I apologize if I am. Um, and Menachem Begin of Israel, and they meet at Camp David, and they spend 13 days negotiating, and they come to two agreements. They took conditions for general peace talks and conditions for peace between Egypt and Israel. And in 1979, the two countries, after 2 decades of on and off again war, sign a peace treaty. So this is a major accomplishment for Carter in human and foreign policy. And then as you can see, the two men there. In 1979, he tried to improve on the SALT I treaty signed by Nixon and the Soviet Premier Brezhnev by negotiating SALT II, which imposed additional limits on certain types of nuclear weapons. But this failed because the conservative Republicans and Democrats opposed SALT II, and the bill died in the Senate. All right, and then as we move into the Middle East or Southwest Asia, Middle Asia, whatever you want to call it, Central Asia, um, is where things become trouble. First, we have Afghanistan, and this started because of what is called Islamic fundamentalism. And the government of Afghanistan was backed by the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to protect the government against what are called fundamentalists. But Carter protested this, and he began suspending grain and high-tech sales to the Soviets. Alright? And the U.S. boycotted the 1980 Olympic Games in Moscow. And what happened as a result? Well, the 1980 Olympic Games, that's the Summer Olympics. The Winter Olympics in 1980 were held in Lake Placid, New York, I believe. And I'll talk more about that later. The Iranian hostage crisis. The Shah of Iran was a strong ally of the United States. And in 1978, the Shah was overthrown by the Islamic fundamentalist Ayatollah Khomeini. I believe I'm saying that right. But Carter allowed the Shah to stay in the U.S. for cancer treatment. Well, on November 4th, 1979, his followers seized the United States Embassy in Tehran. They took 52 hostages. And the hostages were released 444 days later. And this is another thing. We have the economic malaise speech, and then we have the Iran hostage crisis. Another reason why Jimmy Carter lost the 1980 election. Okay? And I think part of the in January 20th, that's Inauguration Day. When Ronald Reagan became president on January 20th, 1981, they let those prisoners go. Why? Most likely because they were afraid of Ronald Reagan and not afraid of Jimmy Carter. Does that make Jimmy Carter a bad guy? No. But it just shows that sometimes an act of aggression, a warning. And one of the things that Reagan often talks about in the 1980 election was that he was very much against what Iran was doing. All right. So we can see here. Now, if you remember years ago, back in the 60s, the United States helped set up that government, put the Shah in power. And the CIA is notorious for having examples of that where they interfered in governments where they shouldn't have. So there's the hostages. And here they are coming home. And then here is a picture of the miracle at Lake Placid in 1980, where the United States, led by a team of young, out of college Americans, beat the Russians in the semifinals, knocking out the Soviet Union, and they called it the miracle. Now they did win the gold. They had to go and play Italy after that to win the gold medal in the 1980 Olympics. Probably one of the proudest moments in American history, and also highly recommend checking out the movie Miracle. Alright, top 10 artists of the 70s. So this is a list based on multiple sites that I researched who were at the top. Most popular artist of the 70s is Stevie Wonder, followed by Led Zeppelin, Elton John, Pink Floyd, the Rolling Stones, Eagles, Marvin Gaye, Queen, James Brown, and The Who. As you can see, rock and roll is the leader of the pack. But that's going to change as we move into the 80s. It's going to be more pop-centric. Some fashion trends of the 70s. We have disco bell-bottoms, afros, as you can see in the picture on the upper right. Movies like Saturday Night Fever with John Travolta. TV shows like Sanford and Son, Soul Train, and Different Strokes. And this is also important because American culture began to spread worldwide, in the 1970s through globalization.